Well, hello. This is an evening episode of National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Marc Ruiz Evans. Today's episode will be dedicated to Ernestina Barrios Ruiz, my grandmother. She taught me as an early young boy that California was stolen by racist Americans, and that's why it's part of America. It was not a happy story, and it did not involve democracy and equality, and it certainly didn't involve the normal state ascension process, as it's called, where a group of settlers move to an area, hold a vote, and are chosen and allowed to join America. Rather, California was conquered. Latin people were denied the right to vote, most of them, or gunned down. Black people were segregated from all other races. Asian people were no longer allowed to own property, and indigenous people suffered a conscious genocide on the scale not seen since 1941 in Hitler's Germany. That is the actual story of California. The reason is not beyond me that the only reason I'm dedicated to the topic of California independence is because it wasn't that radical an idea. I grew up from age 6 knowing this place was independent from America and that it was stolen, and that it was not a story of freedom and equality that allowed California to become part of America. Abuela, this one's for you. Moving on, let's get right into it. Well, one of the things that we saw recently was a article from CBS News talking about polling and support for national divorce. Now, I'll show you some of the references, but I just want to cover some of the major points. This article from CBS News talks about how, basically, in quote, and a few Americans favor the idea, they're referring to a national divorce, as far-fetched as it might be, slamming the idea, of a national divorce between red and blue states. Now, that CBS poll showed 56% strongly opposed national divorce and 21% somewhat opposed national divorce, leading to a total of 77%, according to that CBS poll, that showed Americans were against national divorce. Now, that's key, because there was another article that came out recently where they were talking about how a liberal reporter was backing up Marjorie Taylor Greene, a famous conservative, saying maybe we should have a national divorce. His own newspaper slammed that liberal reporter and said he was stupid and silly for talking about national divorce. And here's the quote from the article. Fortunately, Silveri, that's the liberal, and Greene's seeming willingness to split the country in two puts them as outliers among the general population, according to a new CBS YouGov poll released over the weekend. So the key point here is that you have two articles coming out, and they're saying nobody really backs the idea of national divorce. It's a radical, crazy idea. Only a few fringe people support it, and they both reference the same CBS poll. This is this article referencing that. This is the CBS article. Here's CBS saying far-fetched, few Americans support the idea of national divorce. Here's the other article saying outliers support national divorce. Well, let's take a look at what it actually means. Now, at the same time as these two other articles, another article came out. This one's called Federal Control Needs to be Lessened. Now, what's interesting is that in that article, they say we don't need to pursue national divorce, but they admit there was a poll from the Center for Politics after the 2000 to 2020 election that found 41% of Biden supporters and 52% of Trump voters either somewhat or strongly agreed that a split was positive. That's almost 50-50 of all the voters on both sides of the party supporting the idea of national divorce. I don't see how that's an outlier or few. It's not. The people who vote in the elections choose the form of government. We're talking about almost half of the voters of both parties said national divorce might be appropriate. It gets even more strange. You see, the CBS article and the other article that slammed the idea of national divorce didn't mention this poll by the Center for Politics. They only mentioned the CBS poll. So there's a CBS article, and there's another article saying national divorce is silly, nobody follows it, outliers, few people do it. These two articles did not mention the Center for Politics poll at all. So the two articles that slam national divorce and say nobody really follows this, it's an outlier topic, both of those articles somehow completely forgot to mention the Center for Politics poll that showed 41% of Biden supporters and 52% of Trump voters supported national divorce. That isn't few. That's not an outlier. That's basically half. Now, make it even a little bit more interesting, that CBS poll asked the same question as the Center for Politics poll. Do you support the idea of national divorce? I just want to point out there's a divergence between these two polls of 20+%. So Center for Politics poll showed 41% of Biden's supporters backed national divorce. 52% of Trump's supporters backed national divorce. The CBS poll says, no, that's wrong. It's only 16% of Biden voters back national divorce and only 33% of Trump voters. So we go from one poll that says 41% of Biden voters to a CBS poll that says, no, that's only 16%. And it showed 52% of Trump voters and says, no, that's really only 33%. We're talking about a divergence of 20+%. That's unheard of. Normally, you might see a divergence of 3 to 5%, the margin of error, but these two polls asking roughly similar questions have wildly different numbers. And whenever you see polls that have same question and wildly different numbers, something's rigged and someone's playing a game. Now, I can't prove anything, but the divergence between the polling is not good. That's not a good sign of stability or logic or the fact that this is being held up to some sort of level of accuracy. The other thing that makes this dubious is that the CBS poll and the other article, the CBS article and the other one, never mention the Center for Politics poll. They only mention the CBS poll. So two articles come up. National divorce is stupid. Nobody backs it. How do we know that? Because there's a CBS poll showing only 16% of Biden voters and 33% of Trump voters support this. Those two articles don't mention the other poll that said it was 41% of Biden voters and 52% of Trump voters. Now, when you're doing an article and you're saying X equals this, but we're not going to mention other surveys that showed the complete opposite, it's also dubious. It's almost like you're trying to mislead and lie to people. Let me show you some of those articles so you can see for yourself. We're going to do share screen. So this is the article. Fortunately, here's the one. This is the article by Colorado Compass. This is the liberal who talked about maybe we need a national divorce. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene, the conservative, who talked about maybe we needed a national divorce. They spend most of the article slamming the liberal for how dare he say that Marjorie Taylor Greene has anything remotely worth saying. And here's the phrase that pays. Fortunately, Silveri and Green's seeming willingness to split the country has put them as outliers. And there's the CBS poll that they reference where they're going, look, it's 56% strongly opposed, 21% somewhat opposed, 77%. So 33% of the country must back this, which means they're allies and not really to be believed. Here's the CBS article, and came out roughly the same time. And this article references the CBS article. Here's that CBS article. So, whoops. CBS, new poll. All right, let's go to the phrase that pays. Just to show you it's here. Oh, I think it erased it. Okay. And few Americans favor the idea as far-fetched as it might be. So that's the two of them saying, nobody believes this idea. It's silly. It's stupid. Nobody follows it. Here's the actual CBS News poll. I know it's difficult to see, but if you look here at page 52 of the polling from this article, here's the Biden tally. Strongly favor, somewhat favor, Biden 16%. Somewhat favor, strongly favor Trump at a combined 33%. That is in direct contrast to an article that came out at roughly the same time that mentions this Center for Politics poll showing 41% for Biden and 52% for Trump voters. So why is it that this article that came out roughly the same time as the other two could mention this poll, but these two articles that say no one follows the idea of national divorce could not mention the Center for Politics poll, and only can mention the CBS poll. It's almost like they're trying to trick you and lie to you. That's part one. Well, let's get into the second part. Now, part of the reason that I still follow the idea of CalExit and always will is that everything I said in my book in 2012 is still coming to pass. So Americans, Californians cannot have faith in federal institutions even after Trump. I said you can't have faith in federal institutions in 2012 to the degree that Californians expect services to be deployed, and they cannot have faith in federal institutions to protect the values that we as Californians hold dear. That's only increased in accuracy. A lot of people thought that when Trump was gone, everything was going to snap back into place and work out. Well, total failure, didn't happen that way. Here's an article from San Francisco Chronicle. If the Supreme Court rolls back the Clean Water Act, California will be ready thanks to Trump. What they're talking about was that during the age of Trump, California made regulations so that if the federal government removed certain environmental regulations, California regulations were there in order to keep them in place. Trump's gone. But as we've talked about routinely, America's controlled by a minority of conservative states, about 35 to 45 states that are conservative, white, lacking diversity, lacking youth, mostly Fox News watching, older, and with no real ability to change or become more diversified as they go forward. These states, because of the Constitution itself, have outweighed amounts of power, and they determine the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the presidency, which means they can control all of the laws, the interpretation of laws, and make sure no new laws can be implemented. The Supreme Court is conservative, even though Trump is gone. And the Supreme Court is largely going to strike down environmental regulations that California holds. What they're talking about in San Francisco Chronicle is, thank goodness that California created its own regulations at the level of the federal government for when the federal government fails. Now, California did this for Trump. It's 2 years after Trump, and it is still relevant because the Supreme Court is basically Trumpian. Here's the full quote. Now, here's another thing. Roughly around the same time, the other major newspaper in California, the LA Times, talked about California settlement limits ICE from re-detaining immigrants freed because of COVID. What they're talking about was two medical advisors for the Department of Homeland Security this week denounced the slow and inconsistent efforts to control the spread of the virus in detention facilities. In a whistleblower letter, physicians urged Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro N. Mayorkas to expand access to COVID-19 vaccines and approve treatment medications as well as masks. In a searing response, federal judge Vincent Calabria in San Francisco called the conduct of officials in charge appalling and said ICE had lost the right to be trusted. So ICE was largely opposed by Californians during the age of Trump. Trump's gone. It's 2 years later. And guess what? Joe Biden, the opposite of Trump, the Democrat, who put a California Latino, Mayorkas, in charge of Homeland Security, is massively exposing undocumented immigrants to COVID so that they die in concentration-like camp conditions. Remember, when Donald Trump put Latinos in concentration-like camp conditions, Californians were horrified. When a lot of Latinos were getting COVID because of the cramped quarters, Californians were horrified. When the Latinos died in ICE facilities under Trump, Californians were horrified. Well, turns out, even with the Californian and a Latino and Joe Biden in charge, they are still killing Latin people through putting them in concentration-type camp situations, just like Trump. Remember, Californians mostly hated Trump for putting immigrants in concentration camps. And yet the Democrats under Joe Biden, which was supposed to be completely different, are doing the exact same thing. In fact, the parallels are so egregious that the liberal newspaper, the New York Times, had to admit that the Democrats basically are cowards and hypocrites. They made a big deal about this when Trump was in charge, and the moment they're in charge, they do the exact same thing, and they just don't really want to talk about it. We'll get to that in a second. Let me show you some of the articles just so you can see this is all true. So here's the Los Angeles Times article talking about how Latinos are being put in concentration camp style conditions and dying and getting sick from COVID. At the same time, the government's saying, don't put people in concentration camp style conditions, wear your mask and practice social distancing. They are not actively enforcing that. And that's with a Californian who's Latino hired by the non-Trump administration. Same thing, dead Latin people in concentration camps. Here's the New York Times article talking about how the Democrats used to be upset when Trump did this. And, now that they're doing exactly the same thing, it's cool. Here's the article from the San Francisco Chronicle. Supreme Court rolls back clean water. California will be ready thanks to Trump, talking about how the Supreme Court now, even though Trump's gone, is still a problem. I'll get to this one in a second. So I just want to point out, the immigration system is the environmental regulation system is not upholding California values. Californians were horrified when they thought that Donald Trump might allow oil drilling and sell off public-private property. Californians were horrified at the conditions of immigrants and detention facilities. All the same under Joe Biden. Even with Latin people in charge, and even if they're from California, that's the federal government in two major policy arenas enacting the exact same policies egregiously as Donald Trump, which means it's not Trump. I hate Trump, but it's not him. If the guy in charge was doing X and the new guy who says I'm the total opposite of him is also doing X, it means that the thing behind those two people likes X. America likes Latin people in concentration camps. It likes them dying. It likes them getting COVID. It likes them not having environmental regulations. Otherwise, why would two totally polar opposite administrations enact the same policy prescription? These are called hard facts. But another reason why you need to pursue CalExit is, as we've always said, America's broken, it's sinking, and it's not going to get any better. Here's an article from the New York Times out this week. America has split, and it's now in very dangerous territory. We've covered a lot of this here at National Divorce Talk Raw, where we're talking about different foreign policy scholars are saying that America no longer functions as a democracy when looking at all democracies around the world, and that it's actually failing. Like, a lot of Americans don't want to hear that, but scholars of foreign policy who study democracies and failing governments are saying America's now ticking off all the measures of failed states. Not my words, foreign scholars are saying that in a sober manner. The United States continues to stand out amongst nations experiencing the detrimental effects of polarization, according to a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace report. None of the wealthy, consolidated democracies of East Asia, Oceania, or Western Europe, for example, have faced similar levels of polarization for such an extended period of time. Along the same line, McCoy and press write that the United States has a unique combination of majoritarian electoral system with strong minoritarian institutions. The Senate is highly disproportional. They're pointing out the exact same thing we've been saying for years here. The Constitution says that states have rights, not people. 35 states have massively outnumbered influence. They control the Senate. That means they can stop any legislation. They control the presidency with the Electoral College, which means unpopular presidents can become presidents. Bush, Trump, that's twice. And they also control the Supreme Court, since the Senate has to approve the nominations of the president. So since they own the Senate and they own the presidency, that also means they own the Supreme Court. So now you can block any legislation that you want, and you can have all laws reinterpreted as you please, baked into the Constitution. These foreign policy scholars are saying that's why America doesn't work, because of this combination of majoritarian electoral system with strong minoritarian institutions. That's a fancy way of saying the Constitution itself is the problem, and that's why America's failed and doesn't work and is never going to get better, something we've always said. Now they're saying it's so bad, this place is going into territory that most countries don't survive. Most countries do not go through this level of polarization and not end up in a civil war or split up. Foreign policy scholars are saying that. Let me show you that article right now, just so that you can see the source. Here's the New York Times article. America split. It's now a very dangerous territory. So we can get another view of that. New York Times. There it is. So the point is that when we look at the topic of national divorce, there is a poll showing 40% of Biden supporters and 52% of Trump supporters back the idea. Newspapers are lying to you about that poll, not mentioning that poll, and instead holding up a different poll that's 20 percentage points off. And then they're saying, see, nobody's really into this. But they're not mentioning the earlier poll. It would be one thing if they said new polling comes out and it contradicts this earlier poll. That would be called fair reporting. But when you don't mention the earlier poll and you say only this poll matters, and see, this poll says nobody needs to talk about this, when a previous poll showed damn near half of people on both parties were interested in this, you're intentionally misleading people. And then we can look at the fact that immigration has failed Californians again, 2 years past Trump. Environmental regulations have failed Californians again, 2 years past Trump. And that's only the beginning of whatever else the Supreme Court will do. Remember, this is the Supreme Court that struck down California gun laws a year and a half after Trump. Trump's gone. Trumpian policies are still in charge because of the Constitution, which will never be changed. The only way out is to get out of America. And if that's not enough, as we've talked about routinely here on the show, scholars who study democracies in failed states are saying America, according to those metrics, doesn't work anymore. The ship's sinking. It no longer provides the services that Californians demand. And the country is ripe for a national divorce. We'll leave it there. Adios, abuela.